coming this evening. I'm going to use this mic and sort of hide over here. If this pops, I will step away from it. Before I start, I very much want to thank Jillian Tullis for inviting me to participate. And I'd also like to thank the endowed chair, the Knapp Chair Endowment in general. This is one of the most beautiful campuses I have ever been on. You guys are lucky to work here. You're lucky to go to school here. And I will be happy to take comments and questions following my remarks. So I'm just going to start. In the last couple of years, scores of troubling memorials and what we might call problematic works of public art have been vandalized, defaced, and removed from American parks, plazas, courthouse lawns, and other sites. In spring of 2017, for example, 4 monuments dedicated to white supremacy, to the Confederate States of America, and also to opponents of Reconstruction, were removed in New Orleans after the city council there declared them a public nuisance. These included the notorious Liberty Place Monument, a 35-foot stone obelisk erected in the middle of Canal Street in 1891 to commemorate the victory of white supremacists in a battle over post-Civil War governance in that city. And they included this statue of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, which was erected in New Orleans in 1911 on the 50th anniversary of his inauguration of the Southern State Secession. Prior to their removal, both of these monuments had been repeatedly vandalized with graffiti and with paint. Likewise, in Baltimore, 4 Confederate memorials were removed on August 16, 2017, just a little over a year ago, just days after the deadly outcome of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, during which a neo-Nazi intentionally rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing 1 woman and critically injuring dozens of others. Significantly, the Unite the Right rally was held to protest the Charlottesville City Council's decision to remove the city's Confederate statues and to rename a local park Emancipation Park. On August 11, white supremacists held a blood and soil rally in that park. Here's the poster that they distributed all over the web and in physical form. And here is that blood and soil rally that they held on that Friday night, holding torches, chanting Nazi slogans, referencing racial purity, and encircling a towering monument of Robert E. Lee. In Baltimore and elsewhere, I think Americans followed these events in horror, connecting the dots between monuments, racism, public protest, and violence. Protest against Baltimore's monuments, which included statues of Confederate generals that we see here, Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and of the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney, a Maryland native who authored the 1857 Dred Scott decision holding that all African Americans, slaves and free, were not and never could be citizens of the United States. These sorts of protests against this statue and others had been ongoing for years, and finally, the City Council in Baltimore unanimously voted to remove them. The governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, called their removal the right thing to do. And he added, "The time has come to make clear the difference between properly acknowledging our past and glorifying the darkest chapters of our history." And here we see them in storage somewhere outside of Baltimore at an undisclosed location. Monuments to the Confederacy are, I think, at the top of the list when we think about troubling memorials and monuments today. Partly this is because there's so many of them. In its recently updated report, Whose Heritage? Public Symbols of the Confederacy, the Southern Poverty Law Center states that while 113 Confederate memorials have been removed in the past few years, some 1,740, including monuments, statues, fountains, parks, roads, and schools, 1,740 still exist in the United States. They exist in states like Montana and Idaho, which didn't even participate in the Civil War. Here we see a fountain in Montana, which was dedicated to the Confederacy, and on the bottom right, a US Forest Service campground in Idaho that's named after Robert E. Lee. Following citizen protests that the fountain was a blight on the city of Helena, standing as, quote, a symbol of racism and slavery, the city removed the monument. But there are other subjects that are also targeted today for removal in the American public sphere or have already been removed. So let me share a few examples and talk about some of the context involved. Let's start off with the Balbo Monument, which was gifted to the city of Chicago in 1934 by fascist dictator Benito Mussolini to commemorate the successful transatlantic flight of a squadron of seaplanes from Rome to Chicago, commanded by Italian aviator Italo Balbo. Situated in Burnham Park, just east of Soldiers Field, the 18-foot-tall column rests on an ancient stone pedestal originally from Ostia, whose text, which we can barely read in Italian, it's so faded, highlights the, quote, 11th year of the fascist era. Note on either side of the piece on the top, we can see fasces, and you can see also this really faded inscription. In addition to accepting the monument, the city of Chicago also renamed nearby 7th Street Balbo Drive. While a lot of Americans admired Mussolini and fascist Italy during the 1930s, it's interesting to consider why the city of Chicago did not remove the Balbo Monument during the first few years of World War II, when Mussolini and Hitler declared war on the United States. Today, calls to remove this monument and to rename Balbo Drive are gaining public momentum in Chicago and actually throughout the state of Illinois. In May of 2017, in Minneapolis, this two-story sculpture by Sam Durant was also the focus of heated community debate. Intended as the latest addition to the Walker Art Center's newly renovated public sculpture garden, which features works by Klaus Oldenburg, Katharina Fritsch, and Robert Indiana. And on the bottom right, you can see Katharina Fritsch's big blue rooster, which is, you can see in the far distance. You can also see works by other artists. I think that's Robert Indiana. This is a piece by Klaus Oldenburg here, Spoon and Cherry. Scaffold was inspired by the gallows used in 7 public executions sanctioned by the US government, from the hanging of abolitionist John Brown in 1859 to that of Saddam Hussein in 2006. It was originally made for Documenta 13 in Kassel, Germany, which is a big art show. And then in 2012, it was exhibited at The Hague. And this is where the artist said his intention with this piece was to critique America's history of state violence and capital punishment. And audiences sort of sat around the scaffold, the gallows, and as you can see, it's situated in a beautiful public park. People were encouraged to sort of climb up and around it. Concerts and lectures were held in the space. This sculpture's reception in Minneapolis, however, was quite different. Among the gallows that Scaffold references is this one, built in Mankato, Minnesota in December of 1862, when 38 Dakota Sioux, found guilty of attacking and killing white settlers, were executed in the largest mass hanging in US history. When the Walker Art Center began to install Scaffold, dozens of local Native Americans, including members of 4 Dakota communities, 7 Chippewa and Ojibwe reservations, and the residents of the Little Earth housing complex in Minneapolis, protested that this piece triggered historical pain, was disrespectful, and was inappropriate for a public park. These were acts of genocide, not something to be portrayed between a giant rooster and a cherry, said Cheyenne St. John, the tribal historian for the Lower Sioux community. After several weeks of protest at the site and really furious social media response, the walker and the artist agreed to dismantle the piece and donated its sort of remains to tribal representatives who discussed either burning or burying them in a private ceremony. Artist Durant apologized for his lack of sensitivity to local publics, and he recently remarked, "I think that social and political problems and issues are being superimposed onto art and debates about art. Art is being asked to perform things that maybe it shouldn't perform, which is actual political and social action." In Philadelphia, third example, city officials announced their decision to remove this 2,000-pound, 10-foot bronze statue of former mayor and police commissioner Frank Rizzo. This was erected in 1998, right in front of the Municipal Services Building. It's been controversial, the subject of numerous public protests against police brutality, racism. It's been repeatedly vandalized, tagged with eggs, with graffiti, even outfitted, as you can see on the far right, with a KKK hood. But its removal, or its slated removal, generated even more protest, especially among members of the city's police department. As one citizen supporter of the statue said, "Removing statues is akin to ISIS and the Nazis destroying civilization's history. We cannot let that happen here. This statue is part of Philadelphia's history and its past." But City Councilwoman Helen Jim countered, "Relocating the statue is not and has never been about erasing history. It's about acknowledging how complex and complicated history really is, and being thoughtful and deliberate about what images we uphold in our public spaces." These three troubling memorials are completely different in terms of style, what they look like, what they're made out of, in terms of site, where they're located, and in terms of artistic and what we might call intentionality, sort of the aims of a single artist like Sam Durant, or the ideas of a group, such as the group that accepted the Balbo Monument in Chicago. But I think they share the concerns of Americans today who want to reconcile their ideas and their feelings about historical accountability and national identity. Remarks about historical complexity, assertions that removing statues is akin to ISIS, and comments about what public art can and cannot do reveal the degrees to which Americans are deeply engaged with and at the same time deeply anxious about public culture. Actually, Americans have a really long history of reckoning with monuments, memorials, statues, and other kinds of public art that they deem oppressive, shameful, hateful, or simply out of sync with currently held values and interests, personal and national. In the time remaining this evening, I'd like to trace a few instances of how and when and why Americans have targeted memorials and other forms of public art, and to argue that this is in fact a common and profoundly democratic practice. Memorials and monuments are vandalized, defaced, removed, replaced, when the histories and ideologies that they embody are deemed illegitimate or invalid. This is an age-old practice. Here, for example, is a Roman bust, and we can see that its face has been smashed and mutilated. In the Roman world, this practice, which classical scholars today call damnatio memoriae, and interpret as the damnation or condemnation of memory, is considered the first widespread example of the negation of artistic monuments for political and ideological reasons. Importantly, these Roman imperial portraits, whether inscribed on coins or sculpted in stone, were considered neither immutable nor monolithic, When an emperor was overthrown, his images were, quote, systematically mutilated or physically altered into the likenesses of other emperors. What's interesting about this is that destruction and creation go hand in hand. Both destruction and creation are, in a sense, instrumental to creative processes of transformation, of re-remembering a social, political, and historical record. Many Americans prefer to believe that vandalizing or defacing or removing memorials is something that only other people do in other countries, like French revolutionaries during the Reign of Terror in the 1790s, destroying various royal monuments and eventually the royals, as we see here. Or French communards in 1871, who toppled various statues of Napoleon. You can see the huge statue crumbled there. Or the Taliban in 2001, obliterating the monumental 6th century rock-cut Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. Or Islamic State militants in 2015, destroying the Temple of Baal in Palmyra. But removing and destroying memorials and public art has also been a consistent practice in American history. On July 9, 1776 in New York, the equestrian statue that we see here of King George III, which had been erected about 6 years earlier, was pulled down shortly after General George Washington organized a public reading of the Declaration of Independence to his troops and to the citizens of New York. Now, Thomas Jefferson had listed 27 grievances against the king in that declaration, and he summarized it in this sentence: "A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people." Inspired by words encouraging them to dissolve the political bands of tyranny and seek unalienable rights of life, liberty, and happiness, the crowd pulled down the iron fence surrounding this 4,000-pound statue of George, which was itself modeled on a Roman statue of Marcus Aurelius, and knocked it off its pedestal, eventually melting it down to create 42,000 musket balls for the Continental Army, who relished the idea of firing, quote, melted majesty at the British troops. And the horse's tail, which we see on the right, was somehow saved, I have no idea how, and it's on display at the New York Historical Society. The head of the king of the statue was decapitated, and it was put on a stake just outside Fort Washington in Upper Manhattan. This legendary removal of the statue of King George III in 1776 was depicted by many artists at the time and then well into the 19th century, which further validated both the seizure and the destruction of what was considered problematic public art. Note the participants included in the German artist Johannes Ortel's version of this scene from 1852. We see women, children, merchants, working men, people of color, a Native American family on the far left. And this wasn't an isolated incident. There weren't very many statues of the royals in colonial America, but there were plenty of royal arms, royal portraits, royal emblems, and these were routinely searched out, destroyed, ripped down, and relegated to bonfires in most of the major American cities at the time. In his painting, the artist William Walcott shows the king's right arm and hand directed to the sky, to the heavens, and to his manifestly ordained power and authority. The front and center of the painting, where we as viewers are really invited to get into the scene, is a swirling, messy sort of space. A depiction, writes Michelle Sizemore, of the destruction of the monarch's body and the inception of democracy's indeterminacy. This is an illustration, in other words, of the transfer of power from the king to the people, and the transformation from colony to nation. the toppling of this public statue in 1776 and its celebration in this 1857 painting both portray sacred power falling to the people and demonstrate how rituals of vandalism and removal helped legitimate claims to or desires for new forms of social and political authority. Over the past several centuries, these rituals have steadily advanced. And one of the projects I'm engaged in right now is finding examples of this sort of vandalism and removal throughout the last 200 or so years of American history. Protests against monuments that were commissioned to sort of celebrate white supremacy, for example, are not just the products of today's consciousness about racism, but these were concurrent with their unveiling. This monument that we see here just in a drawn form was dedicated to South Carolina pro-slavery statesman John Calhoun. And almost as soon as it went up, it was ridiculed, vandalized, etc., by Charleston's black citizens. After 9 years, it was replaced, note the difference, by a second statue on a much, much, much taller base and column. The combined height here is about 80 feet. I mean, you only do something like that, remove something and then build it a lot taller, if you're feeling like your precious statue is under threat. It doesn't matter. This monument has also been the subject of repeated public attacks. From being defaced in the 19-teens, there are newspaper reports coming out of Charleston about kids, youth, older people throwing rocks and shards of glass at the statue. And then as you can see here, it's been tagged in recent years with red paint and also with graffiti. Likewise, in 1907, soon after this standing soldier statue was erected in front of the Chatham County Courthouse in Pittsboro, North Carolina, it was defaced with black shoe polish and grease, prompting local officials who were outraged by, quote, one of the most disgraceful acts of vandalism ever known in our civilized community, to offer a $25 award for apprehension of the vandal. I don't know, $25 is not a whole bunch of money, but I don't know if you can read the article on the right, but the last sentence of the piece, which is titled Monument Defaced, reads, "We regret to know that our county is disgraced with the presence of any human being mean enough to commit such a despicable act." Again, acts of vandalism, of property outlawing, these are considered despicable, whereas what the monument itself is all about is sort of ignored. In St. Louis in 1912, many people protested the city's pending acceptance of this granite monument, which was gifted by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a hereditary association of mostly Southern women who saw and still see their historic membership, or historic mission rather, as one of memorializing the Confederacy and thereby vindicating Southern white men from their defeat in the Civil War. Indeed, the ladies of the UDC were responsible for the majority of monuments erected to white supremacy in America over the past 150 years. As one St. Louis citizen remarked, the Confederacy is a lost cause. This is 1912. And we feel that those who supported it should abandon it. But, anxious to support Southern businessmen, many of whom had moved to St. Louis, Missouri after the Civil War, the monument was unveiled in the city's Premier Park in 1914 and was just removed a few years ago. As the physical markers of social, political, and economic interest, and as highly visible stakeholders in historical memory, monuments and memorials possess enormous degrees of power and influence. Their symbolic capital, following on Pierre Bourdieu, helps shape and direct our perceptions of social order, political transition, national identity. Consider the meaning that the Lincoln Memorial holds in American consciousness and has for over 100 years. We may have a heightened recognition of this when public art's symbolic capital is perceived as the embodiment of histories, memories, and politics that we now deem aberrant or treacherous. And in response, we may choose to deface and remove this kind of public art, thereby disgracing it and perhaps erasing it. In March 2003, US soldiers in Iraq pulled down multiple monuments to Saddam Hussein. Indeed, one of the most widely reproduced photographs of the US invasion was the toppling of this 40-foot statue of Saddam in central Baghdad. In August 2017, demonstrators toppled this statue in Durham, North Carolina, originally erected as a standing soldier monument in 1924. And then just a few weeks ago, the statue of Silent Sam, also a standing soldier statue, was toppled on the campus of University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Both of these were among literally hundreds of memorials to the Confederacy erected long after the Civil War, and more specifically, during the era of Jim Crow, the 1890s through the 1920s, and then again in the 1950s and 1960s during the post-war era of civil rights. And you can see this in the Southern Poverty Law Center chart that's been erected. In each era, these monuments were not erected as somber post-bellum reminders of a brutal war, which is how they're often described and defended, but as symbols of intimidation, as deliberate physical assertions of white power, bigotry, and racial terrorism. And there's been some really interesting work done lately in terms of how many of these memorials and monuments to white supremacy were placed either in or right on the edge of growing Black neighborhoods and communities. Public art's presence, assumptions of permanence, symbolic capital, as I've suggested, lends legitimacy to particular cultural, social, political conditions. And I've got a slew of different examples of how public art does this. Multiple parties recognize this and then link the toppling of public monuments with the toppling of the conditions, the histories, the memories that they embody. In 2004, then, anti-war protesters mimicked the pulling down of Saddam's statue in Baghdad by pulling down this papier-mâché statue of President George W. Bush outside the US consulate in Vancouver. In 2011, the government of Bahrain toppled this 300-foot pearl monument in Manama, the capital city, which had been erected by the government itself in 1982. As a symbol of national unity. It became, however, the defining symbol, the rallying point for Bahrain's pro-democracy movement during the Arab Spring. Bahrain's foreign minister justified the government's removal of this monument, which was completely dynamited, at a news conference in which he said, "We did it to remove a bad memory." And the whole thing caused our society to be polarized. We don't want a monument to a bad memory. I think his remarks are revealing, both in terms of his recognition of the Pearl Monument's shifting symbolic capital and his expectation that public monuments be inherently good or socially positive. In my book, Memorial Mania, I take up the links between various kinds of memorials built in the US in recent decades and the feelings, the sort of emotional conditions that many of them embody. The acceleration of memorial making and unmaking in America today, I think, stems from two factors. First, widespread recognition of their symbolic authority. And second, the expansion of rights consciousness, especially following the success of the civil rights movement. Michael Schudson explains that today's public sphere has become a playing field of citizenship where rights for both individuals and groups are asserted and claimed. Subjects formerly excluded from local and national commemoration are now included. Anybody been to the Rosie the Riveter Memorial in Richmond, California? Okay, I see that we don't get up north a lot. Okay, there's reasons, okay. This is the Rosie the Riveter Memorial, which pays tribute to the female defense industry workers of World War II. In Concord, California, this is the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. This pays tribute to the 320 US sailors, mostly African American, who were killed in the worst home front disaster of World War II, a little known incident. In Montgomery, Alabama, the National Memorial to Peace and Justice commemorates the more than 4,000 documented victims of lynching in America. The pace of memorial making has quickened in America today because growing numbers of Americans view public art, monuments, memorials, statues, and more as a powerful expression of their interest, their rights, memories, and feelings in the public sphere. This applies as well to the idea of public arts removal. In February, the City Council of Arcata in Northern California, where none of you ever go, voted 4-1 to remove this statue of President William McKinley, citing in particular the legacy of his imperialism. And I did a little bit of work, and apparently McKinley, until lately, is typically included in a list of the top 5 worst presidents of all time. Now, impassioned rebuttal on all sides of the political spectrum, however, led to ballot measure M for McKinley. So on November 6th, the town's voters are going to decide whether or not this monument stays or goes. In March, San Francisco's Arts Commission voted unanimously to remove a figural sculpture, which is at the base of the Pioneer Monument, which we see on the far left. This sculpture as a whole was dedicated in 1894, and it's about a block or so from City Hall. This particular part of the Pioneer Monument, titled Early Days, features a fallen and partially clad California Native American, anachronistically dressed in Plains tribe garb, cowering at the feet of a vaquero and a Catholic missionary. Protested for decades for whitewashing the conquest of California natives by framing the conflict as their salvation, the Arts Commission, quote, agreed that this racist and disrespectful sculpture has no place in the heart of our city. Many in the audience at that public hearing cheered their vote. In April, however, the city's Board of Appeals overturned it, and today removal is still pending. And the debate over the statue has been ongoing at least since the 1970s. These heated debates over these particular monuments suggest what we might call a cultural turn toward public feeling, part of a larger experiential turn toward affective or emotional modes of knowledge and comprehension. And these are increasingly influencing how Americans today understand history, understand memory, and understand how they position themselves in both. Today's memorials are similar. Today's memorials are less like the one we see on the top, sort of a traditional monument, great men, famous heroes on horseback, and this is the stuff of what we call statue mania, which was an equally excessive public art sort of proliferation of a century ago. Today's memorials are more like what we see on the bottom, places like this Holocaust memorial in Boston that define commemoration in terms of your felt experience. The New England Holocaust Memorial, dedicated in Boston in 1995, features a grid of 6 glass towers, each bearing the name of one of the principal Nazi death camps. The walls of each tower feature the 7-digit numbers that were tattooed on many Jewish prisoners in the camps. In total, 6 million unique numbers are etched onto the glass. Glass, in fact, serves as both window and mirror, reflecting the shapes and movement of the visitors inside, and architecture and trees outside. You'll note that at the base of each glass tower is a steel grate from which warm air turning into fog in colder months comes out, says the architect-designer, quote, like human breath as it passes through the glass chimneys to heaven. While visitors can certainly just walk through the memorial, and many do, it offers multiple opportunities for felt, physical, affective engagement. Some people leave small stones at the memorial, an ancient Jewish custom of remembrance. Many of today's memorials and monuments are archives of feeling, encoded in their material form, their narrative content, and the practices that surround their production, their reception. These are visual and material bodies whose meanings correspond to their felt nuances. Memorial mania, taken as a whole, engages public feelings such as grief, fear, gratitude, shame, anger. These are all the emotional dimensions that characterize contemporary life. These feelings guide both the making and the unmaking, the defacing, the destruction, the removal of multiple examples of public art today. And multiple cities and states are reckoning with these feelings as they consider what to do with problematic public art. A year ago, for example, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio appointed a commission to advise him about how the city of New York should address monuments seen as inconsistent and oppressive with the values of New York City. In the wake of Charlottesville, municipal and state officials throughout the United States have been moved to remove problematic monuments and memorials from public spaces and places under their jurisdiction. In New York, these included this statue of 19th century Dr. James Marion Sims, located in East Harlem on 103rd Street and Fifth Avenue. This was dedicated to a man who founded the first hospital for women in America in 1855 and is largely considered the father of modern gynecology. His legacy, however, is confounded by his unethical medical practices, by which he performed countless experimental surgeries in the 1840s on Black female slaves. In recent years, protest against this monument by groups like Black Youth Project 100, whom we see here, have been common. Last fall, New York's Mayoral Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers held public hearings in Manhattan and the city's 5 boroughs, listening to public testimony about the Sims statue and other problematic monuments. Their task was to assess all symbols of hate on city property and to issue a report on whether or not these symbols should remain on public property or be removed. In advance of their findings, the governor of the state of New York ordered the removal of busts of Lee and Jackson from the Hall of Fame of Great Americans at Bronx Community College. And we can see this Hall of Fame here, the empty pedestal on the right of Stonewall Jackson. This is a sort of neoclassical outdoor sculpture gallery that had been designed in 1900 by Stanford White. Mayor de Blasio advocated in particular for the removal of this commemorative marker on Lower Broadway's Canyon of Heroes. This was dedicated to the World War I hero and former Marshal of France, Henri-Philippe Pétain. During World War II, Pétain was a Nazi collaborator with the Vichy regime, responsible for the arrest and deportation of French Jews to Nazi death camps. Mayor de Blasio vowed that the granite marker featuring Pétain's name, which was installed in 2004 and is one of 206 markers to the honored subjects of New York's ticker tape parades along a stretch of about 13 city blocks from Battery Park to City Hall. This would be one of the first we remove, he said. Other people who've been celebrated with parades and markers include Gertrude Ederle, the first woman to swim the English Channel, and a constant crossword puzzle question. Jesse Owens, the Black American athlete who won 4 gold medals at the Olympics in Berlin in 1936, much to Hitler's chagrin. Pianist Van Cliburn, who's the only musician to ever have a ticker tape parade in New York, and Nelson Mandela, who was honored in 1990. Mayor de Blasio was among many who consider Patain's inclusion in this esteemed group highly symbolic. As one New York assemblyman stated, it's time to remove all of New York City's monuments and markers that glorify bigotry and strengthen that which perpetuates these ignorant beliefs. For some, this includes monuments to Christopher Columbus, like this one at Columbus Circle. Here we see Columbus atop a column which is decorated with bronze ship prows representing the 3 ships of his first voyage to the New World. And we see on the right a bas-relief that shows him and his men stepping ashore into the New World. This gigantic column was originally intended as a sort of grand gateway to Central Park. It was erected to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the explorers' supposed discovery of North America. And as you can see here, it's really dwarfed today by the skyscrapers of the Trump Tower and Time Warner Center. At the turn of the last century, Columbus was honored with statues, fountains, plazas, and parks all over the United States. He was championed as the most important actor in the drama of American discovery. This was complete invention, of course. Columbus was a minor figure in the history of European exploration to the New World. He was a mediocre Italian sailor who never touched the North American continent and summarily enslaved and killed the indigenous populations he encountered, the Arawak and the Taino Indians in the Caribbean islands. However, colonial Americans adopted Columbus as a cultural icon because of the practical need to construct or establish a national identity different from that of Great Britain. So on the 400th anniversary of his first voyage, which was marked in Chicago by a big World's Fair called the Columbian Exposition, Columbus was commemorated, as we see here, as a great man. Likewise, in front of the train station, Union Station in Washington, D.C., the Columbus Memorial Fountain was dedicated in 1912, a fanciful depiction of the explorer symbolically flanked on the right by a bearded gentleman representing the Old World, and on the left by a pensive Native American figure embodying the new. Today, Columbus is largely debunked as a genocidal imperialist, and his commemoration in the United States rarely goes uncontested. Today, the monuments, the statues commemorating him are routinely vandalized, targeted for removal. In 2002, this fountain in Washington was splashed with red paint and then inscribed with the messages, 510 years oppression, 510 years resistance. In 2004, this statue in Boston was marked murderer in red paint, and then in 2006, it was decapitated. In 2010, this 50-foot statue of Columbus in Pittsburgh was tagged with the words murderer and stolen lands, and the hands in particular were blasted with red paint. And then last year, there was a slew of Columbus vandalism. The words "don't honor genocide" and "take it down" were stenciled on this pedestal of a statue in Queens. The words "hate will not be tolerated" and hashtag "something's coming" were spray painted on this statue in Central Park. And the words "kill the colonizer" were tagged on the base of this statue in Bridgeport, Connecticut. That same week, Columbus statues and busts throughout the country in New Haven, Providence, Buffalo, Binghamton, Houston, and Yonkers were targeted with red paint imitating blood, or they were smashed and or beheaded. Columbus iconoclasm isn't confined, of course, just to the US. In downtown Caracas in 2004, demonstrators used thick yellow climbing ropes to pull down a statue of Columbus that we see here. It was then dragged through the streets as thousands of people celebrated the Day of Indigenous Resistance, a Venezuelan national holiday since 2002. As one local website reported, just like the statue of Saddam in Baghdad, that of Columbus the tyrant also fell this October 12, 2004 in Caracas. During New York's annual Columbus Day parade last year, City Councilwoman Inez Barron joined other protesters at Columbus Circle and demanded that Columbus Day, which is a federally designated holiday in the US since 1937, be changed to Indigenous Peoples Day, which the cities of Berkeley, Austin, Seattle, Minneapolis, and Los Angeles have already done, and that the statue in the circle be, quote, at the top of the list of monuments that were hateful and needed to be removed in the city. Columbus only discovered that he was lost, said one state assemblyman. He never discovered anything else. He called everybody Indians because he was looking for India. He was a colonizer. He was a racist. He was a murderer. In recent years, American Indian groups all over the nation have similarly lobbied to remove Columbus statues as representative symbols of hate. In a letter to the Mayor's Committee on City Art, Monuments, and Markers, one group wrote, "We must collectively acknowledge the atrocities of Columbus and admit he has no place in US society today." However, when New York's commission released its report in January, it recommended the removal and relocation of only one piece of public art, the statue of James Marion Sims. A majority of commissioners voted to keep the marker for Petain on Lower Broadway and to keep the Statue of Columbus at Columbus Circle. They concluded their report with this statement: "Now is a time to embrace our opportunity to take a critical look at our history, to understand how this history is inscribed in our public places, to listen carefully to one another, and to work actively toward a vision of what we wish our legacy to be." Mayor de Blasio noted, "Reckoning with our collective histories is a complicated undertaking with no easy solution. Our approach will focus on adding detail and nuance instead of removing the representations of these histories." This idea of adding to problematic public art or contextualizing it with plaques and with text panels or with even more examples of public art, more memorials, more monuments, is widely discussed. In 2016, for example, the plaques that you see here were added to Baltimore's 4 Confederate monuments, each of the plaques concluding this monument was part of a movement to perpetuate the beliefs of white supremacy, falsify history, and support segregation and racial intimidation. But keeping Confederate monuments in place keeps the Confederacy's racist ideology in place, on a pedestal in the public sphere. Plaques and text panels are no match for the visual and physical authority that these monuments typically command. This equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee on Richmond's Monument Avenue is 61 feet tall and occupies the center of a very large grass island. Its imposing size and space is a major draw. 150,000 people attended its dedication in 1890, and thousands, as you see in this image, continue to flock to this monument today. The addition of this plaque in 1984 to the much protested Pioneer Monument in San Francisco did little to counter the public anger that the sculptural grouping Early Days generates. As historian Daniel Sherman notes, contextualization of this and any other public work of art begs the question of who determines what context is appropriate. Last August, just 8 months after those plaques were added to Baltimore's 4 Confederate monuments, the monuments were removed, like others, to an undisclosed location. Their pedestals remain, the plaques were eventually taken down, so what's left in these public spaces is sort of interesting in terms of these pedestals. I'd like to suggest, as I wind up here, that these currently undisclosed locations become disgraced memorial parks, following the examples of monuments and memorials that have been removed and then dumped into unwanted heritage sites. In the former Soviet Union, such as Museon, also called the Fallen Monument Park in Moscow. Or this park in Taiwan that features hundreds of statues of former dictator Chiang Kai-shek. Or this park north of Old Delhi, which features a graveyard of Raj-era statues, including those of George V and various British viceroys. Removal, paired with ruination, distances monuments from their dominant symbolic authority, vanquishes their representative ideologies, and permits audiences different and new opportunities for felt experience. Ruins, from the Latin word ruere, or to fall, are the appropriate context for the collapse of core values that we deem aberrant. Worries that neo-Nazis might flock to disgraced memorial parks full of Confederate monuments are offset, I think, by the fact that defaced, vandalized, or failed monuments are humiliating and shameful. They're not honorific or triumphant. Reckoning with troubling memorials in America today might begin then by reimagining them as ruins and using their degradation and their decay as a prompt to rethink, maybe reset our social and political priorities. Thank you.